thank you all for coming to this, our final Visiting Writer Series event for the semester.
And the year.
And the calendar year, for sure. I wanted to take a hot second to thank someone who we haven't publicly thanked before, and that's Dana over here doing all of the IT. Yay! Thank you so much.
Yes, Dana!
For those of you who follow us on the Facebook page, the Wells College Visiting Writer Series Facebook page, videos of past events are available up there absurdly quickly because Dana has figured that out, and it's always a relief to get an email finding out that Dana has changed the password for that account yet again, so I know he's on the case. And as always, we want to thank Niska for the support for all of the Visiting Writer Series events. But tonight, you guys are here to welcome Jerry Mirskin, and for once, I'm not doing the intro. So I'll just do a brief thing, and then I'll introduce the person who's doing the intro, and then we'll get on our way. First of all, the Wells Chronicle is out, hot off the presses, and available back there with snacks. So feel free to grab one. I'll remind you at the end of the event. It's looking great. Alan's already grabbing whatever he can. We're good. This will be great. And then, as always, we have a beautiful broadside from our visiting writer, and I want to show it to you because our own Rich Kegler of the Book Arts Center outdid himself once again. Yeah.
That's nice.
He sent me a picture of the metal type that he had laid out to make this happen, and it looked like an insane torture device. And I was impressed and awed. And so these are here. You should just come up and touch this paper, really. It's a beautiful experience just to do that. These are available for sale tonight for $10 and $25 thereafter online. So get them while they're hot and cheap. Hot and cheap, both of those. They are hot too, because he finished printing them like a minute ago. And the other thing that will be available for sale at the end of the reading is indeed Jerry's new book, Crepuscular Non Driveway, which you can purchase directly from the poet, who will sign it for you and probably talk to you if you're nice. So, one thing that I think is very exciting and rare for many contemporary poets is to get surprised by like a sustained, careful, attentive reading of your work. And the Holland's Critic came out with this very long, very thoughtful, very generous and sympathetic review of Jerry's new book, and it's by a man named Howard Nelson. And he's going to come up and introduce Jerry right now. So please come on up, Howard.
You got extra introductions tonight.
Introduce yourself, Howard.
Well, I'll say it's very nice to be asked to introduce the poet at Wells. I've been coming to poetry readings here for a long time, even longer than Bruce Bennett. The first poetry reading I attended here was in Cleveland Auditorium, and it was Denise Levertov. And then I think the next year, Bruce arrived, and we became friends and collaborated many times over the years, bringing poets to Cayuga County here and in Auburn at Cayuga Community College, where I teach. So a lot of memories are stirred up standing here at the introducing podium in the art exhibit room. So the poet is Jerry Mirskin, and as Dan just said, I wrote an essay about it. I write mostly poems, but I was taught the idea that a poet should also write critical essays every now and then. And that every once in a while a writer would excite and inspire me enough to do that. So that's what happened with Jerry Mirskin. I had known his work for a while, but then he came out with this new book Crepuscular Non Driveway, and I was blown away with pleasure and admiration, so I sat down to try and write about it. And I settled on the title early on, "The hard part is knowing what to say," which is a line from one of his poems, but it also described my experience trying to write the essay. It is a hard thing to know what to say about a book of poetry sometimes, especially one that's as seemingly transparent and artless as this one. So I was working along, and at some point I reread the blurbs on the back of the book, and I was a little demoralized for a while because it seemed like they had already said what I was trying to say. And it almost stopped me in my tracks, but then I kept going. So what I'd like to do by way of introducing the book is to read one of the blurbs and then one of my own paragraphs afterwards. So this is what you find on the back of the book. I love this collection of poems. They are easy and fun to read, yet challenge me to think creatively in order to understand the deeper meanings within. Reflections of wisdom, joy, thankfulness, sadness, enlightenment, redemption, and a common thread throughout of benevolent good nature and humor inform these wonderfully crafted poetic stories about family, place, and happenings. Without trying, they inspire me to live life more fully and perceptively, and to experience the magic and spirit in everyday things. This is a collection that I'll enjoy reading often. So I go on to say, well, yes, right on every point. The author of the comment is Hank Roberts, who is identified as musician, which is to say, I suppose, he's not a literary specialist, which is to say, the poems are accessible. To me, accessible is a good thing, a victory for poetry. Not everyone agrees. I don't always agree myself. Easy is a controversial word. Easy and fun to read, maybe more so. It would be like a death blow for many books of poetry. There's a case to be made for density and difficulty. They can be wonderful poetic qualities. The joy of Hopkins, Gerard Manley, comes through them, and the pleasure of T.S. Eliot. But Mirskin's kind of easy is a subtle thing, and it involves no sacrifice of richness, of texture, or thought. So, I would like to welcome you to the subtle easiness, the plain-spoken artfulness, the serious humor, the humorous seriousness, the sincere irony, and the rich simplicity of Jerry Mirskin.
Wow. Thank you for the honor of inviting me here. Is that my water? Wow. What a spread. I first came to Wells College about 35 years ago, met Bruce, and was in this, I think it was this room, and said, wow, poetry. And sort of like that dwelling in the evening air that Stevens talks about. So thank you for the invitation and the support. In Bruce's work, I first perceived that humor was admissible. I saw you do a reading at the public library in Ithaca. I said, wow, of course. You want to use all of your intelligence, so it's nice to have you here. And grateful to Rich for the amazing broadside that they created. And that paper, yeah, you could like sleigh ride on that paper, so it's very cool. This doesn't really get any better for a writer than this. Hi, Alan. You know, to have the notary of another writer's appreciation, that's very meaningful. And I've read in a lot of different places, but I find it particularly meaningful to read on a college campus. Some say that when you leave college, you go into the real world. But I tend to think that there's an extra amount of, as the French say, an avoir du poids, a certain weightiness of reality on college campuses that's really just part of this problem, this precinct, maybe this time of life, where you get to sort of stare into reality, you know, and stare into being, maybe even stab at it a little bit with your pen, or maybe if you're a Charles Simic fan, with your fork or something like that. Have you read any Charles Simic? Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, yeah, I've read it a lot of places, but I particularly like colleges, again, for that sense of reality. I mean, there's a lot of reality in guitar stores, don't get me wrong, but here it's very special. When I first started writing, another venue that was important to me was laundromats, because nobody invited me to read. But I wanted to accomplish something that would still play in public. It was important for me to have the poetry live not only on the page, but in the air. So I would go to laundromats and recite my poems, and it was great because you want to have a lot of practice, but you don't want to be embarrassed, but nobody can hear you, so it doesn't matter. And I could just sit there and revise my poems and recite them, and people will be just doing their thing, and no one bothers you. It's really great. And this first poem isn't in a laundromat, but it has a similar kind of maybe background, mnemonic hum. I'm talking about Niagara Falls, and I refer to the machinery of the falls, I think in this poem. Poetry reading. At the poetry reading, I stood at the podium, looking out over the crowd. I probably shouldn't say crowd. There might have been 20 people in between the shelves in the back of an old bookstore in Buffalo. They were good to come out on a cold, wet end of winter day. They were my audience, and I wouldn't be there if it weren't for them. Sure, I had a book, but still, if no one wants to get off the couch after dinner, there's no reading or reader. So I have to give them that, though I still felt like I was the one standing and they were sitting, and it felt like I was peering out at them. Sort of how the water at the top of the falls looks out over the edge and contemplates that long going over. It was like that. I was the poet at the top of the falls. In fact, that afternoon I had gone to Niagara Falls. I went to the Canadian side, as you're supposed to get the good view, and I looked it over. Have you ever been there? It's dramatic. You can't really figure it out. All that water, all that roaring, that might be the main part. The roaring and the mist. And because it was the end of winter, there was still snow. With all that falling water, the mist comes up and the snow comes down and builds up for what looks like 10 stories high and a couple of city blocks wide. And all the while, the falls continues, roaring its head off. And that's how I looked out at the crowd. Who can do that? They just sat there looking at me like piles of snow. Buffalo, what a great place to give a reading, even if they don't know what you're talking about. They do. I wanted to read a poem from my first book. I was going to read one poem from my first book and one poem from the second book, and then mostly from the recent book. This poem sort of, for me, kind of speaks a little bit to what poetry is about. mentioned I was having a hard time. The name of the poem, the title of the poem is Not Drowning, Waving. I'm riffing here off of another poet's poem. Stevie Smith wrote a poem, Not Waving, but Drowning. And I was having a little hard time, but not that bad. It wasn't that bad. I went to Jones Beach with my parents, and just started swimming. They were sort of anxious. Sad and swimming out beyond the first few cuffs of how far they would go, I sense it is my fate to see them walking the shore's steep plank, staring into the sand. Look at how they clutch themselves tight to the bosom, wrapping the bands of their arms like shrunken wings. They took a long patronage, choosing to be parents, not out of existence or the cards, but the swim of the times they were in, the good sidewalks and streets that led to parenthood. It's odd, but I feel as if I had chosen them. I take them with me as I enter the ocean and swim from shore. My positive strokes say it's possible to leave one's life and begin again. It's not so easy. Not easy to be a parent and take the world as adversary. They keep watch, and I see them recede, though I would know them a mile away for how time has seized their honest bodies. I would like them to be fearless as I swim beyond the small rifts and friendly waves into the deeper coves and darker spirals. I would like them to know, but if I were to wave as they tread the sand, they might not understand. I swim only for expression. How can I, an adult swimmer, enact my fate in the face of such innocence? I should swim back and tell them, tell the downcast eyes, speak to the clutching arms. Throw that into the ocean. Anybody been to Jones Beach? No? Oh yeah. Don't you want to go in? Just keep going. I thought I'd read a few poems from the new collection that just speak to my immaturity, because I feel like in some way, immaturity is maybe imminent maturity or preliminary, and maybe only in reflection or understanding. But when I got into this third book, I really started telling stories. I found I really liked it. So that poem I just read had that slender lyric kind of thing on the page, and these poems were written more like in the flash form, and just straight narrative. And then I formatted them to play on the page, how I wanted them to play on the page, like a score, so you could see how they would be read as a score. This one's called Setting the House on Fire. I read this one, and my mother hadn't heard this story, and didn't know it. She's sitting in the audience, and later on she said, "You did that?" It was good. All morning we searched the neighborhood for opportunities, as if we were, did I say the title of the poem, Setting the House on Fire? Yeah. All morning we searched the neighborhood for opportunities, as if we were giving ourselves gifts, setting things on fire, like true ritual wrapped us in the moment, in the magic of how paper flashes brown and pops into flame, or how cellophane curls and eats itself and disappears. What better occupation? What better way to fill the vacant cell of childhood? And how lucky we were that we were not caught in the crawl space beneath that building and got out and ran home, the small clocks of our lives still ticking. In retrospect, it would have been good to have a prayer for each time something was made to manifest, to shine. If this had been any other occasion, I might have asked my father, is there a prayer for fire, an incantation for letting the light out of a twig, for turning a cold stick into a hot wand? I would think my father would know. Many years later, I asked my grandmother what my father was like when he was a boy. On this occasion, memory did not have to be retrieved from another room, another time. Without hesitation, she said, he always smelled like fire, reporting the same privacy that I believed was my own. Without a lot of foresight, my friend and I ignited some insulation in a crawl space under the apartment building across the street. In a minute, it was ablaze. Fortunately, we got out and no one was injured. But for an hour or more, we weren't so sure. I remember I went right home, and more, how deliberately I steadied my walk as I passed by where my father sat in the living room, reading a newspaper, knowing that the flames we conjured in a moment of recent thoughtlessness were not yet fit to print. My goal, as I slid into my room, was to hide the smoke of my clothing in the bottom drawer of a dresser that my parents had recently painted blue to match the innocent walls of my childhood room. I don't remember if he looked up as I walked by, asking for nothing more than the silence I gave him. I was, in that moment, inventing something that I needed, something that I would take with me into the world. I changed my clothes, folding them to match those that had been folded and placed in a dresser by my mother. And a minute or two later, I was returning to the scene to watch the firemen draw their chariots to the scene, to see the people gathering like a neighborhood jury. Had we committed a crime? With each strike of a match, my friend and I were bearing witness to the world's hidden inventory. Now, standing with the others within the collective awe, watching as the trucks seethed and crouched by the curb, and the men tugged at the hoses and pointed great ropes of water at the flames, I could discern how different fire is from human labor, how easy it works, and how much effort it took to melt the flames and bring moment after moment into sharp focus. This is what it is to live in time. It is in time where everything is accomplished. Sometimes those accomplishments betray a hidden light, but even then, there seems to be a cost. I don't know if I stopped to measure the sharp edge of my confidence when a boy from the neighborhood came up to us and said, I know you did this. What I knew down to my shoes was that I was not going to be trampled like the dirt we stood on. What did I learn? What did I understand when, as if striking one final match, I answered, no, we didn't. I suppose those words were just a small step from saying nothing to my father a few minutes earlier. But now my intuition glowed with something more powerful than fire. Sometimes I wonder what I would have done if I had heard earlier about the smoke on my father's clothes. I believe I would have done the same. I would have gone into my room and felt in the silence the cinders of what I had done and the cinders of my small, solitary self. And then I would pass by my father a second time on my way out into the world. I want to read another poem of immaturity, but one that isn't so stricken with a kind of risk. Well, this one seems risky in retrospect, not really. And you'll have to judge for yourself. This one isn't, this one's probably about 5 years later, when I was in 9th grade. Do you remember being in 9th grade? Being kind of like part human? Well, the girls were more human. By 9th grade, the girls were like on their way to being, you know, women. But boys in 9th grade, remember that?
I do.
Let me know if this corresponds to your experience. 9th. It was 9th grade, a Spanish class, I know that, though a lot of what you're doing at that time is unknown. Our teacher, it was her first job out of college, her name was Miss Nasberg. This was the mid-60s, rock and roll, miniskirts, the whole party was just warming up. She might have been fairly average, but we didn't know. 23 years old, she had the power. One of the first things she did was give us Spanish names. Suddenly my buddy Ray was Raimundo and I was Geronimo. The names were part of a masquerade that complemented our immaturity. In another era, we would have been learning something like how to milk a cow or how to saw a board. But there we were, sitting in a room, buzzing with boy energy. I don't remember a lot, but I remember the other kids acting like idiots. When Miss Nasberg turned to write on the board, the sight of her legs exploded in our immature brains and sent waves of hysteria across the room. Every time she turned, compressed lunacy, idiots, though for the most part she put up with us and smiled and laughed off our behavior as typical. I was okay with being typical. But there was this one time that I went a little further. I don't know what I was thinking when I sneaked into her car and hid behind the back seat, that she would take me back to her apartment and teach me what I needed to know, a private tutorial in the rites of passage. I don't know, maybe. I just thought she would think it was funny, and that would be that. I was surprised that my little plan worked as well as it did. She got in and drove out of the school parking lot and out onto the expressway without knowing that I was right behind her, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal myself, which I did at some point. At some point, I popped up my head and said, "Hi." You're probably wondering if she had a heart attack, if the car swerved and hit a tractor trailer or went flying off the road. No, it was better than that. And in retrospect, I realized she wasn't average. She had something and expressed it perfectly when one of her students appeared in her car on the highway. Maybe she was a bit surprised, but certainly not startled. And her response made me feel that I had done the right thing. "You idiot," she said. It was a perfect response. And for a second I thought that maybe something was possible. For in class she talked to us in Spanish, but now she was talking to me in our regular language. "You idiot," she said, and I had a feeling it couldn't be any better. I was going to read my Pez poem, but I think I'm going to just stay with, I'll read the Pez poem, it's fun. I wanted to read a poem from my second book. Here's a picture of Wendy on the cover. Anybody know where this is from? Take a guess. The title of the book is Flagrante Delicto, which means, anybody on the left taking Latin? It means kind of caught in the act. It usually has a kind of sexual, innuendo, it usually refers to the sexual act, but I like the title because for me it was something more about being caught in the act of looking, which is I think what poets are doing. You guys know what Pez is, right? You guys, right?
Yeah.
You guys Syracuse fans? Let's gonna make this work, I don't know. You guys know who Skinner, B.F. Skinner is?
Yes.
Who's B.F. Skinner?
Skinner box.
Say it again?
The Skinner box.
The Skinner box. What's that about?
So he was a psychologist,
Right?
and he created a box that he raised his baby daughter in,
Oh,
mice, right?
Well-
He had mice, but then he also had would control the environment when his daughter was really young.
right. So he was doing this with mice, and then he thought he was
Behaviorist
apply,
psychology.
apply these behaviorist principles to people. Right, thank you. So I refer to Skinner here, and that whole time when people were trying to sort of control your behavior, instrumentally. And I also use the word bullion. So I'm not talking about like the soup. I'm talking about like the, like the gold blocks here. You guys know who Prince Charles is, right? Yeah. The guy, the Prince Charles who's forever been a prince. Pez. Before Skinner and increments of reinforcement, there was Pez, pellets of species-specific candy, a product of the Industrial Revolution that put things in packages, brought meaning to cardboard and cellophane. Now you could get a pack of something, and the stuff in the pack looked better than their ancestors. Those lumpy cigarettes you roll by hand, or the cakes grandma made with rumpled crusts and hunks of fruit. I remember how an open pack of cigarettes looked like ammunition, a line of bullets, perfectly straight teeth. Come to think of it, that was probably when they started clamping down. All of a sudden, everyone was wearing braces and smiling their big industrial smiles. It was all part of the process. Pez came in a dispenser. That was key. You didn't just eat this stuff like feed from someone's hand, but with a flick of your thumb, you forged a perfect tab. A compact block of powdered sugar emerged as if from an assembly line, manufactured from the force of your hand. It was not unlike how Superman turned a lump of coal into a diamond. And this is my best line of all time ever writing my writing. I'm gonna just give you a little heads up here. Let me back up, because the best line is coming. It was how Superman turned a lump of coal into a diamond. It was the nearest thing to witnessing birth. The cool thing was you could take it with you everywhere and be ready for anything. One time, after reading an essay by the young Prince Charles about what he would take with him in the event that during a war he was deserted on an island, my teacher asked us to write a similar essay. She didn't tell us what the smart and practical prince put down, and I don't remember all of what I wrote, but I remember I got the answers wrong. My list, which included my bicycle and the dispenser, didn't compare. I pictured myself on my bike, zipping from foxhole to foxhole. With my ready dispenser, I slid between salvo and salvo and moment to moment. Clearly, I was delirious. And I think that image really bothered her. For what could you teach someone who had a gadget of self-reliance, a personal dispenser of candy bullion? But I had something she couldn't give me and could barely control. It's called enthusiasm. And when I put it to good use, like not beating up my brother or burning down the house, my parents gave me Pez. few more poems from the book. This is the first poem in the collection. I kind of like it. I refer to, in this poem, Joe DiMaggio. You guys know who Joe DiMaggio is?
Baseball.
Who's Joe DiMaggio?
Baseball player. Baseball.
Nailed it.
All right.
Very Maryland number.
Good to know your baseball players from your behaviorists. That's good. I like that. This one, I called my uncle. This poem gives me a little bit of nostalgia for telephones, you know, when you're on the phone in that way, and there's a sensation of when you're not walking and talking, that you can go a little further into a conversation in that shared moment. I called my uncle. I had something to tell him. Out of the clear blue, he sent me $500. He was giving gifts to his nieces and nephews. I was living in Binghamton, working as a substitute teacher and living in a crappy apartment. I don't know if I would have worked from day to day. I didn't know why he was giving me a gift. But when I saw the check, I was grateful. My uncle was old school. When he died, a friend referred to him as a diamond in the rough. I thought about what I knew of him. He had been in World War II. There were some stories, hard times. At his funeral, his brother, my dad, told a long rambling story about how my uncle took my father to a baseball game when my dad was young. My father stood by the grave and recounted. He remembered that on that day, the famous player, Joe DiMaggio, hit 2 home runs. It seemed like a funny story to tell at a funeral, and even more odd was how my dad referred to the baseball player as Joe D. Looking at the hole in the ground, he said, and Joe D. hit 2 homers. He hesitated, as if trying to find a few more words. Nothing. Then eventually he said, I liked him, and took a small step back. I wasn't sure whom my dad was referring to, the baseball player or my uncle. And then I realized it must be my uncle, his brother. He was talking about his brother. It was a year earlier that I called to thank him. I felt my uncle had looked down from somewhere and saw where the dark was collecting in the corners and wanted to do something for me. When I called, I told him I wanted to thank him. He didn't say anything. I said it was a surprise. I listened, waiting for a response, wondering if there was something else I could say. That's the hard part, knowing what to say. I imagined my father's brother in his Bronx apartment the way he was the last time I saw him. How he came to the door in his underclothes and then rested in bed while we talked. I hadn't seen him like that before. It was the beginning of his physical decline. Before that, he was all strength and good humor. Now on the phone, it was as if we were both standing in the dark. The undivided dark that we all share, but must abide alone. Maybe it was that made me really feel the simplicity of his gift, and I told him I didn't think I deserved it. It was then that the silence on the other end of the line seemed more intense. I heard a sound like someone trying to breathe, and then I realized he was crying, quietly sobbing. Years later, after I gave a poetry reading, a friend of my father's came up to me and shook my hand, and then he surprised me. Holding my hand a moment longer, he said, "You're not nothing." We were standing in the doorway. I wasn't sure what he meant. I still remember that. I didn't know, but I sensed it was meaningful. After some time, it came to me, and I knew what to say. "Thank you, Uncle George." I said, "I love you." And before I hung up, and then for some time after, it seemed my uncle and I were dwelling together in a timeless place. a different place, not this one. So I'll read two more poems. Okay, I'll read two more poems. I was going to read the roadside poem, but I think I'm going to read Mike and then the title poem. It seems to me that a lot of the poems in this collection are sort of about encounter, and it interests me. I'm trying to make sense of what it takes to feel for another person when that ability of empathy gets kind of like activated. Because if you know anything about psychology, Piaget says we can do it when we're 5 years old. You know at 5 years old that when you're hitting your brother, he's not experiencing the same thing you're experiencing. Before that, you're both having fun, right? But at 5 years old, you get it. You can sort of separate yourself from the other's experience. But it's something that we have to activate. It doesn't happen automatically. You can do it, but you have to make it happen. So it's interesting to figure out, like, what is it that recruits that response from us, that empathetic response? And I think a lot of times it has to do with work. If you're working together, you get to know another person in a way which makes it easier to connect. This poem's called Mike. In New York, freezing is about 42 inches. That's how far you have to dig if you're putting in a foundation. In this case, we were digging by hand because a backhoe couldn't get in. I'd done work like that before. One time on a farm, I had to dig a grave for a calf. I remember I was up to my waist in the hole. It was winter. The farmer came by, looked down and said, "That's deep enough." Another time I was digging and found a row of horse teeth. They were coated with dirt, but after I cleaned them off, I realized that they weren't teeth, but a row of keys from an adding machine. I remember holding the unearthed numbers in my hand. They'd been in the ground for some time, but I had a feeling they could still add. Now it was summer and hot, over 90 degrees. The foreman came by, Mike. He was a good guy, but I couldn't see it. All the others were inside, and I was out there in the heat. He picked up a shovel. It wasn't work that a master carpenter would do, but he started in. I wasn't assuaged. I wanted to know why I was the one in the hole. He didn't say. I knew a little bit about him. He had graduated high school and went right to work. By the time he was 25, he was an accomplished craftsman and even taught a class in construction at the local community college. I also knew that he was recently married. His wife, a cute but tough girl, drove motorcycles in a circus. She was one of the riders in the round steel cage going around and upside down, held by centrifugal force. Often there was more than one motorcycle in there. It was really loud and smoky, and you wondered how they didn't get dizzy or collide and crash. Mike was in love with her. The circus was in Florida. One night she called him. They'd been going together on and off. She was sick of it, but didn't know what to do. Mike got into his car that night and drove 20 hours to where she was. He proposed and they came back together. He would talk about her. Sometimes he would even share some of the private things they did. Other times he talked about how he'd come home from work, tired. She wasn't working and she was lonely and wanted to play. He told me how he used to stop at a park on the way home sometimes and take a nap so that he had energy to be with her. I pictured him lying on the grass in some park, resting between his work life and his home life. We were digging. After a while, we stopped to take a drink. The sweat was pouring off. He looked at me. I realized that he'd probably have to go back inside, but he didn't go in. Instead, he started talking. He said that his dad died 5 years ago. He said that he couldn't get used to the idea that he would never see him again. His dad would never see him with a good job or a wife and all they were planning. I hadn't ever seen him upset. I haven't actually seen a lot of men upset. He said he would work for a whole year in a trench and give all his pay if he could just see his dad for 5 minutes. A year of one's life for 5 minutes. I tried to picture that meeting, the meeting that couldn't happen. The truth was as flat and hot as the face of a shovel. For a moment there was quiet. There was sadness, but it felt peaceful. After a while, Mike went back into the house, and I went back to digging, back to the girl in the cage, back to driving all night long on the highway. Let me read this last poem, this is the title poem of the collection. You guys know who Jimi Hendrix is, right?
Yes, sir.
Wow, you guys got my back. This is really nice.
You do all I kiss the sky.
Great.
Yeah.
Exactly.
This guy,
Say it again?
this guy, I always thought the line, excuse me while I kiss this guy.
That's good.
My daughter corrected.
That's cute. I don't think you're the only one who thought that.
No,
I think I thought that too.
I know, it sounds
Excuse
like.
me while I kiss this guy. Yeah, that's cool. So I'll read this and if, you know, if there's time, maybe have a question or two. It's been really nice being with you. I feel your presence. I believe, as Robert Pinsky does, that a poem comes into being in the listener's ear. So when you hear it, it's fully realized. So thanks again for being here. Crepuscular Non Driveway. I try not to antagonize. I try to get along. First with my wife, I wasn't born yesterday. And with my son. He's here with some friends and we're having a barbecue, snacks and drinks. He has drums set up in the garage. There are electric guitars and amps. One of his friends is a singer. She's wearing a floral print dress. Her name is Cami. They're getting ready to play and I have the feeling that it's finally happening. The dullness of winter is gone and spring is coming true, just like it said it would. It's sublime and everyone seems to be feeling it. I go in to refresh my drink. I usually don't think about refreshing my drink, but here I am. Just then my neighbor from across the street, an old school codger, is coming down the drive. When we moved into the neighborhood, he crossed the street, introduced himself and asked, "Are you mechanically inclined?" I'm pretty handy, I thought to myself. I fix things, he said. If you ever need something fixed, let me know. I pictured a table of toasters, blenders, old radios. Thanks, I said. That was several years ago. Now he's headed straight for the garage where Cami is holding the microphone. Seeing her standing there reminds me of a television show my wife and I watched this past winter. Singers compete and the winner gets to record. It's one of our main sources of togetherness. Every once in a while, one of us will say, "That's something," and the other will say, "Yeah, but not as good as so-and-so." And a good feeling will hover over as we watch. We also have a new kitten. When we're not watching the TV, we're watching the kitten fly around the room, bopping off the walls, onto the tops of tables and chairs. If we had a chandelier, the kitten would be up there. That show and the kitten got us through winter. Now it's spring and here comes the neighbor, dour, like he's been carrying a load on his back so long it's become part of his back. As I walk over to meet him, I realize it would have been nice to invite him to the party. And just then an electric guitar starts up, very loud. You'd think Jimi Hendrix was alive and well and just happened to be in the neighborhood. Cammie hasn't started singing, and I'm wondering, how are we going to hear her? The neighbor is saying something I can barely make out, shaking his head like an umpire, standing in the dust around home plate, saying no, no, no. And when I finally hear his words, they are no, no, no. And he adds, it's not going to work. In one hand, I have my refreshment. With the other, I wave to the guys to hold up. I'm not the boss of springtime and parties, but it is my place, and my hand hangs in the air like the wannabe master of all I survey. Not going to work, he says again. I assume he means the volume. I can't have it, he says. I have to work tomorrow. It's about 8 p.m. Up until now, the day has been sipping from a long, cool drink. The air is starting to darken, the last of the light pouring off. I'm trying to remember the name for that light, that time of day, crepuscular. But I can't think of it now, and at the same time, I'm feeling a little stumped. In the 10 years that we've lived here, we've never had a party, and the one time we do, there's a complaint. The noise has stopped, and my son and his friends have come over to see what's going on. I want to respond with something neighborly. After all, what we're doing on this first day of spring is good, but underneath it, I can't believe Mr. Fix-It is saying I can't have a party. I want to be diplomatic, but the words lining up in my head bump into one another as they come to the tip of my tongue. And all that comes out is, come on. I'm a little immature, and later I'll imagine that I have a wand and cast a spell. Crepuscular Non Driveway. I point and there's a puff, and when the dust settles, everything is calm, and Mr. No, No, No has returned to his side of the street. But for now, all I have is, come on. No music, he says. That's all he has. In the meantime, my son, who has come over and is standing next to me, seems to be growing larger and larger, like a genie that has been stuffed in a bottle for a long time and is suddenly out. His arms are big and folded across his chest, and he's gazing down at the little man from across the street. He looks at me to see if I'm done talking and then says to the neighbor in a kind of pseudo-tender voice, "You don't like the blues?" I think it's funny, but I also know that it's important to be respectful, and I don't want to give the genie the message that that's how you talk to your neighbors. It's a critical moment in my parenting, and I feel I need to set an example of courtesy, even when one doesn't feel it. The neighbor stands there for a moment, waiting for someone to say something else, and then he turns and starts back to his house. I ask my son to turn off the amps, which they've already done. The girl has put down the microphone, and the musicians are standing around chatting and smoking cigarettes. I look inside our house. My wife is in the kitchen. For a second, I think I see her moving flowers from the counter and putting them in the sink. But then I realize there are no flowers yet. She's just putting away a few dishes. It's dark now. Across the street, through the neighbor's window, I can see the pale light flashes from a television that floods what otherwise looks like an empty room. And for a moment, I think I'm seeing the light of our era. Flickers on empty walls and inner cells. And for some reason, I think of creation. How there must have been a lot of light flashing, explosions of light. And for a moment, I feel for him. It's a little sad at the beginning of time, and the sound is deafening. Thank you.
I have just one question to kick us off maybe, is you present these poems as a kind of autobiography, and I was just wondering about your relationship to like how honest do you feel like you gotta be in these? Do you ever find the poem wants you to lie and you're looking at it and you have to make that call?
I think that's a really interesting question. You know, because poets are like memoirs, so they're not making up stuff exactly. And yet, the character in that last poem isn't exactly me, right? It's sort of like a guy with a cap like yours, right? He's got a little edginess, he's kind of cool, he's talking almost Ray Carver-esque in a way. And so I'm almost working through that voice because, you know, language is a mask to begin with. So there's a little persona, slight persona quality to the speaker in my poems. It's important to me though because I'm drawing on my own experience. I had an interesting experience with my dad who, you know, I wanted my dad to understand my poetry. And in my first book, he read the book and he said, I don't understand any of that, right? So then I wrote this. And he said, I understood most of it. And I said, well, tell me what you didn't understand, I'll fix it. And then, when this book came out, and I'm telling stories, I felt like I had arrived at how I wanted to express. He said, I understood it all. And then the next thing he said was, but I didn't do that. You know, and I'm thinking, uh-oh, what is he referring to? He's referring to the fact that in one of the poems, it's entitled, My Father Threw a Plate. Well, he didn't exactly throw a plate. He threw his fork down and the spaghetti hit the wall, right? So I'm on the phone with him. He said, I didn't do that. And I said, well, you did something. And then he said, oh yeah, well, you know why I did that. So I'm not telling you exactly right, but I'm telling like, you know, like Dickinson would say, I'm telling it slightly. But it's pretty close to what I feel and remember, and I think for most poets, they try to tap into that deep recollection. And it's in trying to understand that truth that the poem sort of maybe emerges through that process. So that's really important to me. I have one poem in here that's a Goldilocks poem, but that little bear in that poem is kind of like me. Good question.
So storytelling is somewhat newer for you, I mean, as a central part of it?
Yeah, again, I sort of wrote these pieces more like flash, which is that blend of like micro short story and poetry. And I still feel it's poetry because the pieces resolve poetically. They don't resolve narratively, you know, they just end and there's either it works or it doesn't. And there's an understanding. And I don't think I can write, you know, stories. The way in which I make sense of things come together in a more poetic kind of resolve. So I like the storytelling thing, but I still feel like I'm not going to make a lot of money.
So that last poem ends in the image
Yeah.
of looking through the
Yeah.
window,
Yeah.
the light on the wall.
Right, and understanding, yeah. And that moment of, there's a slight empathy there. It gets fused in there. That, you know, and I didn't actually ever share the poem with my neighbor. I almost want to share it with him. He still lives across the street. I'll hang out a little bit. Are there any general questions, thoughts?
Do you think that you set out to write a narrative, or do you start writing and it becomes like an autobiographical, almost narrative? I mean, I guess all poems are a sort of narrative, but yours are very, I guess, specific.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's sort of.
I think the thing is that writers want to write.
Yeah.
You know, they want to have that work. And there's a lot of back pressure to poetry. It's hard to get things to work in that kind of narrow form. And I found that for me, there was more fluency in telling stories, but I didn't realize that until this recent collection. And I realized I liked it. I like telling stories. And in some ways, I feel like the whole story allows the reading to kind of precipitate out of the story. So where before, if you were thinking about like a graph, and there was this parabola on the graph, that lyric is the parabola, but without the graph paper. And now I want the whole thing, the graph paper and the image, and it all work together, you know, and let it come out of the story. And oh, the other thing is I feel like it's easier to connect. And when I started telling stories, people like my dad could understand. And that was important to me. Because I was sitting in a classroom one time, and I invited a poet into my class, and he referred to poetry as a code, and it bothered me. You know, I didn't want it to be, you know, exclusive.
Yeah.
And so it was important to me to be able to write something that the guys I work with and my dad could understand. So no, I think it's more now, it's rather than looking for that cool line, just letting the story go and see where it goes, and then finding, yeah. Thanks, good question. Okay, well, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I just very quickly, as a quick reminder, Jerry's book is here available for sale. Just talk to Jerry. The broadsides are here for those who talk to me. Thank you, Howard, for jumping in and being our introducer. And to all of you, there's been like a core group of people who have come to Visiting Writers event after event all semester, and this is putting these together as a labor of love, but that doesn't make it not labor. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate it, and it's been such a treat to see like wonderful attentive faces all semester. I look forward to more. We've got a great lineup that is slowly coalescing, almost finished for next semester, and when it is complete, I will crow from the rooftops. But in the interim, thank you all so much. Good luck with the rest of the semester, and come hang out and talk to Jerry.
Woo!